My father cut me out of his will for my stepmother's son. Now he's begging me to save him from the truth. I'm a 35-year-old woman, and if someone had told me 5 years ago that my own father would stab me in the back for a child who isn't even his, I would have laughed in their face. My dad and I? We were unbreakable. At least, I thought we were. Everything shattered the day he married Sylvie. Sylvie came into our lives like a storm. Beautiful, charming, 10 years younger than him. From the start, I had a bad feeling. She was too perfect, too sweet. My father, widowed for years, fell for her instantly. And she brought her son with her. Hugo. 23. Unemployed. Shiftless. A leech. I tried to be civil. I smiled. I played along. But it was obvious Sylvie had an agenda. She isolated my father little by little. I went from being the daughter he called every day to barely hearing from him once a month. The real blow came after his heart attack. I flew in immediately. I sat by his bedside. I helped with everything: doctors, medication, organizing the house. Sylvie? She posted on Facebook about how hard it was for her, but barely lifted a finger. That's when my father, still groggy, mentioned the will. "It's all taken care of," he said. "You're protected. You're my only real family." I should have known better. 3 months later, the lawyer called. My father's will had been updated. The house? Left to Sylvie. The inheritance? Split between Sylvie and her son. Me? A token amount. A slap in the face. I felt like the floor vanished under me. I confronted him. I asked him why. I begged him to explain. His eyes, once so soft, were cold. He told me he owed it to his new family and that I was selfish for making this about money. I couldn't breathe. But it wasn't about the money. It was about trust. About everything we'd shared. About the daughter he raised, the daughter who never left his side after Mom died. And then, 2 weeks later, I found out the truth. Sylvie's son? Hugo? He wasn't just a leech. He was blackmailing my father. Over something dark. Something my father begged me not to dig into. But I won't stop until I find the truth. Because now I have nothing left to lose. I wish I could tell you I held it together after reading that will. I didn't. I fell apart. Fully, completely. I sat on the floor of my apartment for hours, the printed copy of the testament spread across my lap, my hands numb, my heart racing so fast I thought I might faint. I kept reading the words over and over. To my beloved wife Sylvie, I leave the house and its contents. To Hugo, whom I've come to see as my own son, I leave. I couldn't even finish the line without choking. And then the line about me. So cold. So clinical. A token amount, to honor the memory of our bond. Our bond. I couldn't breathe. I texted him. He didn't answer. I called. Straight to voicemail. It felt like my whole world was crumbling. This wasn't just money. It wasn't even just betrayal. It was like I had been erased. For 2 weeks, I didn't eat. I barely slept. I kept replaying every memory: birthdays, road trips, the way he used to tuck me in at night after Mom died. All of it, gone. And then he called. Out of nowhere. His voice shaking. He asked me to come over. He said it was urgent. I almost didn't go. But something in his voice, this cracked, broken desperation, made me drive over. When I arrived, he looked hollow. Smaller. His hands trembled when he poured himself a drink. Sylvie wasn't there. Hugo wasn't either. He sat me down and said the words I'll never forget: "I made a mistake." I didn't say anything. I just stared. He told me, haltingly, in fragments, that Hugo wasn't who he appeared to be. That there was something he knew about Hugo, something dark, something dangerous, and that Sylvie had used it to control him. I pressed him. I begged him to tell me. But he wouldn't say it. He just kept whispering, "It's too late. I've ruined everything." I asked him why he changed the will. His eyes filled with tears. He said he'd been pressured. That Sylvie threatened to expose everything if he didn't comply. I felt ice in my veins. Expose what? I asked. He broke down. Full on sobbing. He said he'd done something terrible years ago, something Hugo somehow found out about, and Sylvie was using it to control him. I tried to get more names, details. But he shut down. He just kept repeating, "I can't lose everything. I can't lose my reputation. You wouldn't understand." I left that night shaking. My stomach twisted. My head spinning. Something was deeply wrong. I started digging. I spent the next week combing through everything I could find: public records, social media, old newspaper archives. I asked around quietly, people I trusted. And then I found it. An old police report from 25 years ago. A name I recognized immediately. A scandal that had been hushed up. My father's name wasn't in the headline, but the details were all there. He'd been involved in an accident. A hit and run. A young woman, killed instantly. No charges. No trial. Case closed. Settled quietly. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the mouse. I felt sick. That's what Hugo knew. That's what Sylvie was holding over him. Somehow, they'd dug it up. And now they were using it to bleed him dry. I confronted him again. This time I didn't hold back. I told him I knew. I told him I understood now. He broke down completely. He told me everything. How he'd panicked that night all those years ago. How he'd run. How he'd lived with the guilt. How Sylvie found out, he still didn't know how, and she'd used it to control him ever since. I asked him why he didn't just go to the police, confess, come clean. And he said, brokenly, because they'll ruin me. And I deserve it. I felt frozen. And then he grabbed my hand, something he hadn't done since I was a child, and whispered, "Help me. Please. I don't know what to do." And in that moment, despite everything, despite the betrayal, I realized, he was still my father. And I had to choose, save him, or let the truth destroy him. I wish I could tell you that when he grabbed my hand that night, his eyes filled with regret, his voice shaking, that I felt forgiveness. That something in me softened. But the truth is, I felt absolutely nothing. I was empty. I looked at the man who raised me, the man I thought I knew, and for the first time in my life, I didn't recognize him. He sat there, clutching my hand like a drowning man, and I knew in that moment that whatever decision I made would shape the rest of both our lives. And the worst part? I didn't even know what I wanted. I left his house without saying much. My head was spinning so violently I thought I might pass out behind the wheel. The entire drive home, I kept replaying every memory, childhood birthdays, holidays, the way he used to call me his little champion. Had it all been a lie? Or was this broken, terrified man, the real version of my father that I'd never seen before? For days, I couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror without wondering who I was in this story. The daughter? The protector? Or the fool? And Sylvie. Sylvie was everywhere. The next time I visited my father, she was there, smiling, sweet as ever. Acting as if nothing had happened. Offering me tea, complimenting my dress. I wanted to scream. Instead, I played along. Sat politely. Watched her every move. Every too sweet word. Every sideways glance. She knew I knew. And I could see it in her eyes, she wasn't scared. She was confident. That's when I realized the depth of the trap. She wasn't just manipulating my father, she was manipulating the entire situation. She was the one holding the strings, and we were all dancing. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let her win. I started digging harder. I spent hours on old forums, archived newspaper articles, anything I could find about that hit and run. I tracked down the name of the victim's family, a sister who, as far as I could tell, still lived 2 towns over. I debated for days. Should I contact her? Should I tell her what I knew? In the end, I did. I met her in a small cafe. Her name was Emily. She was in her 50s now. I told her everything. Not all the details, I left Sylvie's name out, but I told her the truth about my father. About the will. About the blackmail. She sat there silently for a long time, then she wiped her eyes and whispered, "I always knew it wasn't an accident. Thank you for telling me." When I left that cafe, I felt something shift inside me. I couldn't protect him. Not from this. Not from what he'd done. The next day, everything escalated. I received an anonymous letter. No return address. Inside was a single photo, me, sitting with Emily in the cafe. And one line written in thick black marker, "Stop. Or you'll regret it." I dropped the envelope. My heart was pounding so loud I couldn't hear anything else. It was Sylvie. I knew it. Or Hugo. Or both. They were watching me. I called my father immediately. Told him what happened. He broke down on the phone, literally sobbed. He begged me not to go to the police. Not to ruin everything. I told him I wasn't the one ruining anything. I told him he needed to take control of his own life. But he couldn't. Or wouldn't. That's when I realized I was on my own. I started documenting everything. Every message. Every interaction. I bought security cameras for my apartment. I changed my passwords. I lived in fear. But I wasn't going to back down. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized Sylvie and Hugo didn't just want the inheritance. They wanted everything. Control. Power. Silence. And if I let them scare me into walking away, I knew exactly how this would end. I'd lose everything. Not just the house. Not just the money. But my name. My sanity. My family. And maybe even my life. The morning after I received the anonymous photo, I woke up with one clear thought: if I didn't take control of this, it was going to destroy me. I could barely recognize the person staring back at me in the mirror, hollow eyes, sleepless, raw. But underneath that exhaustion, there was something else I hadn't felt in weeks: anger. Not just fear, not just heartbreak, pure, burning anger. They had underestimated me. All of them. Sylvie. Hugo. Even my father. I wasn't going to disappear quietly. I called Claire, an old friend from university who had become an attorney specializing in estate law and family disputes. We hadn't spoken in years, but the second I explained what was happening, her tone changed. She told me to come in immediately. I brought everything: copies of the will, the threatening photo, the timeline of what I'd discovered. I laid it all out in her office, my hands still shaking but my voice steady. She listened. Carefully. Took notes. Asked sharp, precise questions. And then she looked at me dead in the eyes and said, "This is serious. Very serious. And you need to protect yourself." We spent hours strategizing. She explained the options: contesting the will, filing harassment charges, even potentially digging deeper into Hugo's background to see if they could discredit him. But then she asked the question I'd been avoiding: are you prepared to expose your father's past if that's what it takes? I didn't answer immediately. Because the truth is, I didn't know. I left her office that evening with a folder full of legal paperwork and a head full of confusion. I kept thinking about Emily. About that woman who had lost her sister and never got justice. About my father's tearful confession. About the silence I'd lived in my whole life without even knowing it. I couldn't sleep. I sat up all night scrolling through old family photos on my phone. Pictures of my dad smiling. Me on his shoulders as a child. Birthdays. Holidays. How do you reconcile the man who taught you how to ride a bike with the man who left someone to die on the side of a road? The next few days blurred. Sylvie kept up appearances, fake smiles, casual texts about family dinners, little digs about making peace. I ignored her. I went no contact with Hugo entirely. But then came the second hit. I received another letter. This time it wasn't anonymous. It was from a lawyer representing Sylvie. A formal cease and desist. They accused me of harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. It was pure intimidation. But it worked. I felt my stomach drop all over again. I took it straight to Claire. She was furious. She told me it was a scare tactic, nothing more, but even she admitted they were escalating. That night, I made another decision: if they wanted war, they'd get it. I went back to Emily. I told her everything, this time, all of it. The will. The blackmail. The threats. She sat in stunned silence. And then she said, quietly but firmly, "I'm ready to talk. Publicly, if I have to." We agreed to take it to the police. The next week was chaos. I filed a formal harassment complaint. I submitted every single piece of evidence. Claire filed an injunction to freeze the execution of the will until the case could be reviewed. Emily provided a witness statement. The dominoes started to fall. And then came the real bombshell. One of Hugo's ex-girlfriends, someone I tracked down through social media, came forward. She told me, in terrified whispers, that he had a history. Not just manipulation. But violence. Blackmail. She said he'd ruined her life. That he'd done it before. I got it in writing. I took it straight to Claire. She nearly fell off her chair. Now we had something. We filed for an emergency hearing. The judge granted a temporary block on any asset transfers related to the will. Hugo was officially under investigation. Sylvie, suddenly, went silent. And my father? He called me in the middle of the night. Sobbing. He begged me to stop. Said he'd confess everything if I just walked away. That he couldn't live with the shame. And for the first time I felt nothing but cold, hard steel in my chest. I told him, calmly, "You made your choice the day you signed that will. Now I'm making mine." The line went silent. And I knew, there was no going back. The morning after I told my father I was moving forward, no matter what, felt like stepping into a different version of reality. It was as if the air itself had shifted. I woke up knowing there was no way to undo what I'd set in motion. The strange thing was, I felt calm. For the first time since this nightmare began, my mind wasn't spinning. The fear was still there, but it was buried under something sharper: clarity. They had declared war on me. And I was going to fight back until the end. The next few days unfolded like a slow-moving storm. The legal process was grinding forward. Claire and I prepared for the emergency hearing, gathering every scrap of evidence, cross-checking timelines, building the narrative of manipulation and coercion that Sylvie and Hugo had carefully constructed. And then came the next blow. My father was hospitalized. It wasn't a heart attack this time, it was stress. Or at least, that's what the doctors said. High blood pressure, anxiety-induced arrhythmia. He was kept for observation. I didn't know how to feel. I visited him. Of course I did. Because no matter how much anger I carried, some part of me still remembered who he used to be. He looked small in that hospital bed. Frail. Pale. His hands trembling. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. He whispered, "I'm so sorry. I let them get into my head. I let them take everything." I didn't cry. I couldn't. I just sat there and listened as he finally told me the full story. It started small. Sylvie was sweet at first. Supportive. She made him feel young again. Then the comments started. The manipulations. Little by little, she isolated him. Made him doubt me. Made him feel like he needed her, like he owed her. And Hugo was the weapon she used. She found out about the accident somehow, probably through old family gossip or public records. She told him. Together, they held it over my father's head. What I didn't know until that moment was this: Hugo had threatened to go public. To sell the story to the press. To file anonymous complaints. He'd even hinted, darkly, that if my father didn't comply, bad things could happen. It wasn't just blackmail. It was extortion. My hands clenched into fists on my lap. I asked him, flatly, "And you just let them?" He nodded, brokenly. I was scared. Of losing everything. Of losing you. The words cut through me like a knife. Because by choosing fear, he had lost me. I left the hospital that day without promising anything. I told him the legal process was already moving forward. That I couldn't stop it. And I meant it. The emergency hearing was set for the following week. Claire was relentless, sharp, brilliant, precise. She made it clear, we weren't just going to block the will. We were going to expose everything. And then, 2 nights before the hearing, I received another letter. Hand-delivered this time. No envelope, just a single sheet of paper with a typed message: "Back off or you'll be next." No signature. No address. Nothing. I felt cold all over. I called Claire immediately. She told me to photograph it, log it, and report it. We did. The police took it seriously, finally. But the fear was back. Crawling under my skin like ice. And then the biggest shock came. Emily, the sister of the girl my father killed, called me, breathless. She'd been contacted. By Sylvie. Sylvie had offered her a payout. A bribe. To keep quiet. I felt something snap inside me when I heard that. This wasn't just about me, this was about silencing a victim's family. About burying a crime. About erasing every ounce of truth. I called my father. Told him everything. His voice broke. He whispered, "I never wanted this." And I said, for the first time, without tears, without shaking, "You made this happen." The hearing was now days away. The case was bigger than an inheritance. It was about justice. About truth. And I knew, no matter how this ended, the person I used to be, she was already gone. The morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized myself. I wasn't the same woman who had walked into my father's house weeks earlier expecting to find love, safety, family. That version of me was gone, burned to the ground by betrayal. What stood in her place was something sharper. Harder. I remember buttoning my coat with hands that didn't shake. My heart wasn't pounding. My mind wasn't racing. I was calm. Cold, almost. Because I knew, deep down, that whatever happened that day, I was already free. I arrived at the courthouse early. Claire was already there, going over last-minute notes. The moment I saw her face, I knew she had news. She pulled me aside. Quietly. Carefully. "We have a problem," she said. "Your father's side is claiming undue influence, that you manipulated him into confessing. They're trying to discredit your evidence by painting you as vindictive and unstable." I let out a bitter laugh. Of course. Of course Sylvie would twist this into something grotesque. I sat through the first half of the hearing in near silence. Hugo was there, smirking, dressed like he was auditioning for a part he didn't deserve. Sylvie was her usual porcelain self, calm, polished, every hair in place. And my father? He sat with his head down. He looked like he'd aged 20 years overnight. The lawyers made their cases. Claire was brilliant, clinical, ruthless when she needed to be. She presented the threats, the letters, the testimony from Emily. She introduced the witness statement from Hugo's ex. And then it was my turn. I stood. My palms were dry. My voice steady. I told the court everything. From the first changes in my father's behavior, to the blackmail, to the threats. I spoke calmly, clearly. I refused to cry. I refused to let them paint me as hysterical. When I finished, I sat down. Hugo refused to meet my eyes. Sylvie glared. My father, he wept silently. The judge called a recess. Claire and I sat outside on the courthouse steps. The winter air cut through my coat. I could barely feel it. That's when my father came to find me. Alone. His hands stuffed in his pockets, his face drawn. He sat beside me without speaking for a long time. Then, softly, he whispered, "I'll fix it. I'll make it right. You don't have to do this." I turned to him. "It's too late," I said. "This isn't just about me anymore. You let this happen. You handed your life over to people who used you, and you watched while they tried to destroy me." His hands trembled. His eyes were wet. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I never meant for any of this to happen." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But there was a weight in my chest that wouldn't lift. I told him the truth. The only truth I had left: "I don't think I can ever forgive you. Not for this." The final hour of the hearing was brutal. Claire dismantled every one of their arguments. The judge, to his credit, saw through most of the lies. And then the ruling came. Temporary suspension of the will's execution. Full investigation into the harassment claims. Hugo's involvement officially noted. I won. But it didn't feel like winning. I walked out of that courthouse and felt nothing. Just numbness. In the weeks that followed, things unraveled fast. Hugo disappeared, left town, according to whispers. Sylvie went silent. The inheritance remains frozen to this day. And my father? He's tried to call. Sent letters. Messages. All apologizing. All begging. I haven't answered a single one. Because the damage is done. The daughter I was? She's gone. And the woman who took her place? She doesn't forgive. The weeks that followed the court hearing blurred into something surreal. I kept waiting for the adrenaline to fade, for the fog to lift, but it never really did. Even after the judge ruled in my favor, even after Hugo vanished like the coward he is, I felt like I was living in someone else's life. I thought winning would feel like closure. It didn't. The house, the one my father tried to hand over to Sylvie and her parasite of a son, sat empty. The keys were still in legal limbo, but no one was contesting the temporary freeze. My lawyer told me it was only a matter of time before the assets were restored, before everything my father had tried to give away would be mine again. But I couldn't stop thinking about the real cost. My father. The man I loved. The man I thought I knew. And the secret he carried, the secret that broke everything. The calls from him didn't stop. He left voicemails nearly every day. Some were desperate, some quiet and resigned. Others? Full of raw regret. He begged me to talk. To let him explain. To see him. I ignored every single one. I started seeing a therapist around that time because the nightmares wouldn't stop. Dreams of Sylvie's smile. Of Hugo's threats. Of my father's face, twisted in shame and panic. I kept reliving that hospital room, his hand clutching mine, his voice begging for help, and I kept asking myself, how did I miss it? How did I not see the cracks sooner? The worst part was how alone I felt. Friends were polite but distant. Family, what little I had left, either stayed silent or subtly sided with my father, as if somehow I was the one who went too far. The emotional isolation was unbearable, and then, out of nowhere, I received a letter. A real one this time. Handwritten. The handwriting was shaky, but I recognized it immediately, my father's. I sat at my kitchen table for an hour before opening it. Inside, the words bled off the page, "I'm dying. The doctors told me last week." I have less than 6 months. Please. I need to see you. Before it's too late. I dropped the letter. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I sat there for hours. I thought about the man who raised me. About the betrayal. The manipulation. The cowardice. And I thought about the man who, beneath all of it, had still been my father. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't eat. The next morning, I stood outside the hospital again. Same place. Same smell of disinfectant in the air. He was in a private room. Alone. He looked worse than I remembered. Thinner. Grayer. His eyes hollow. When he saw me, he started to cry. Quietly. No dramatics. Just silent, steady tears. I didn't deserve you, he whispered. I didn't move. I just stood there. I let him talk. He confessed everything, again. Every last detail. The night of the accident, the bribe that kept it quiet. How Sylvie used it to wrap him around her finger. How Hugo drained him of money, respect, dignity. I thought I was protecting you, he whispered. But I destroyed everything instead. I sat down. For the first time, I looked at him not as my father, but as a broken man. A human being. Flawed. Weak. I didn't say I forgave him. I didn't say I hated him. I just listened. Because deep down, I knew the truth, no amount of words could ever undo what had been done. He asked me, softly, if I'd come back. Not for inheritance. Not for family gatherings. Just, to be there, at the end. I left without giving him an answer. I sat in my car for hours afterward, staring at the steering wheel. I thought about my mother. About everything she'd fought for. About the legacy she left behind. And I thought, who am I now? I don't know. All I know is this: the girl I was died the moment I read that will. And I'm not sure the woman who replaced her knows how to live with the pieces. I don't know how long I sat in that parking lot after leaving the hospital. Time didn't feel real anymore. I kept replaying his face, his words, the way his voice cracked when he begged me to stay. And somewhere deep inside me, I realized the most painful truth of all: I didn't hate him. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. It would have been so much easier to just hate him and be done with it. But the reality was messier, heavier. I pitied him. I resented him. I mourned who he used to be. And none of that erased the fact that he was still my father. I went home that night and sat on the floor of my living room, surrounded by piles of old photo albums I hadn't touched in years. Pictures of us at the beach. Christmas mornings. Him teaching me how to ride a bike. It felt like looking at someone else's life. For days, I couldn't bring myself to make a decision. Should I visit him again? Should I let him die alone? Should I forgive? Should I fight until the very end? The silence was suffocating. Then, one morning, I got the call. He was gone. Just like that. Before I could make peace, before I could say goodbye properly, before I could even figure out what I wanted, he was gone. I remember the feeling, not sadness exactly. Not anger. Just emptiness. I went to the funeral. Of course I did. The bare minimum. Sylvie was there. Wearing black, putting on the performance of the century. Crying softly. Clutching her fake pearls. Hugo never showed. Typical. I stood at the back of the cemetery while the words were spoken. While people I barely knew patted my shoulder and told me how sorry they were. None of them knew the truth. None of them knew who this man really was, or who I had become in the process of surviving him. After the ceremony, Sylvie approached me. Alone. She looked drained, but her eyes still had that familiar coldness. He loved you, you know, she said softly. Even at the end. I didn't answer. She sighed. The will's being reviewed. I suppose you've won, in the end. I looked her dead in the eyes and said quietly, "This was never about winning." She didn't reply. She just turned and walked away. In the weeks that followed, everything slowly untangled. The estate went through probate. The inheritance, the house, the land, the remaining accounts, was restored to me after the legal freeze was finalized. Sylvie backed off. Hugo vanished entirely. On paper, I won. But what I inherited wasn't just property. I inherited a broken name. A past I'll never be able to outrun. A version of myself I don't even recognize anymore. People keep asking me if I'll sell the house. If I'll leave town. If I'll move on. I don't have answers for them. I visit the house sometimes. Not to stay. Just to sit on the porch. To listen to the wind. To remember. My father is gone. The lies are gone, but the scars? They're still here. I don't know who I am now. I only know one thing: I survived. And sometimes, that has to be enough.
Follow me for more stories.